Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar series. I hope everybody can hear me, and I have the big privilege of introducing our speaker today. Professor Rodney Jones has been a researcher in pyrometallurgy for nearly 4 decades, and he's widely regarded by his peers as one of the industry's foremost speakers and communicators. He is well known for his extensive work in computer modeling of the thermodynamic and thermochemical processes relevant in smelting, and has been a visiting lecturer in pyrometallurgy at various universities around the world. In recent years, he's focused his attention on development, commercialization, and industrial implementation of modern pyrometallurgy processes. And if you know Rodney at all, like I've had the privilege of working with him for over 20 years, his career is littered with numerous achievements and honors, but I think personally his legacy is evident in the career of all the researchers that he's worked with over the many years at Mintec in particular. In this area, he's authored and co-authored many excellent technical papers, and personally is probably the inspiration for me writing papers today. So I think he's eminently the best person to talk about this topic today, and he's here today to share with us his wealth of knowledge in this area. Thank you very much for making the time available to us, Rodney, and you may proceed, and we are eagerly listening.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for the kind introduction, Isabel. I've been asked to talk on the subject of writing a technical paper for publication. So I'll divide the talk into 3 sections. The first will be a little bit of history and philosophy, because that's what I enjoy. Mm-hmm. The second will be an introductory, practical set of tools for how to write a technical paper. And then the third one will be maybe some more contentious issues that I would like to raise to maybe get some debate and discussion going. So I hope there will be something in this for everybody. So the first question to ask, I guess, is why write a paper? And the answer to that will depend on where you're coming from. If you're answering this on behalf of society, I guess you would say that it's really to further the cause of advancement of knowledge. If you're coming from industry, it's to communicate ways to improve industrial practice. It's all about the implementation of new ideas. If you're coming from academia or universities, the mantra of publish or perish still is very prominent today, for better or for worse. And promotions and subsidies depend on ability to publish good papers. If you're coming at this from an individual perspective, I guess you could answer that all of the above would apply, but it's also about developing your own reputation as a scientist, an engineer, a researcher, somebody practicing in industry. You also want to establish the priority of ideas. Peer-reviewed journal papers have been around quite a long time, actually. Scientific publishing of these papers has been in existence for over 350 years, since the first issue of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society was published back in March 1665, under the guidance of Henry Oldenburg, who was the secretary of the Royal Society and first editor of the publication. In the early days of scientific societies, members used to regularly meet in person to discuss science and run experiments. They would read scientific papers, and then after the meeting had taken place, which often included rather robust debate, they would publish not only the proceedings of the presentation itself, but also all of the questions and debate would also be documented for posterity. The picture here shows Nikola Tesla giving a demonstration in 1893. Now, I don't have a photograph of what it would have looked like when SAIMM began in 1894, but I'm imagining there would be many similarities. Of course, in the intervening centuries, the size of science, as measured by the number of researchers or the number of publications, however you wish to quantify this, it's increased by an estimated 5 orders of magnitude. That's 100,000 times growth. That's significant. And it is said that 80 to 90% of all the scientists that have ever lived are alive now. And this results in approximately 2 million scientific papers being published annually in over 60,000 scholarly journals. Now that's quite hard to keep up with. It's not quite the same as thinking, well, what did Isaac Newton write last month in our journal? It's a lot more tricky today. One of the other really pressing issues of our day is how do we distinguish between good and bad science and between fake news and reliable information? If you think of some current controversies, such as climate change, what it is that we should be eating, or the current issue of the coronaviruses that are currently winning quite a battle in our world at the moment, it's important to get to really good quality information about these topics. We rely on scientific evidence in order to get closer to the truth. Now, scientific progress relies on the publication of ideas and experimental results that can be replicated and tested and improved over time. So how do we go about controlling the quality of what gets published, especially today when it's so much easier to publish information than it was in days gone by? Now, the system of peer review is used to maintain standards and also to improve the quality of papers that eventually get published. So what this process entails is that reputable journals would first check that papers that are submitted to them meet their required standards in terms of layout, structure, clarity, and language. Then at least 2 independent and usually anonymous peers or experts in the field are asked to read the paper in detail and comment on its technical merits and validity. So if 2 peer reviewers agree, that's quite clear, the decision will be made to accept or reject the paper. But if the reviewers disagree in their evaluations, then it is necessary to bring on a 3rd reviewer who is also asked to evaluate the paper. The job of reviewers is that they should correct or they should reject incorrect or sloppy work, but can also make helpful suggestions to improve the quality of final accepted published papers. So the way it works is that when a reviewer is given a paper to review, they are asked to make recommendations either to accept with no changes, which is very rare indeed, to accept with minor changes, to tell the author to revise and to resubmit from the beginning again, or ultimately to reject. Now, peer review is imperfect, and I'll elaborate on that in a moment, but it is the best system that we have. It's like the saying about democracy being the worst form of government except for all the others. You know, we have to work with what we've got. There are many examples, even from Nobel Prize winners, of papers that were incorrectly rejected initially. Peer review is a significantly flawed but very vital system. There is little incentive for reviewers to invest sufficient time to pick up all errors in publications, and any ineptitude on their part is usually protected by anonymity. Peer reviewers are not paid, nor are they held accountable ultimately for their views. The process is costly and time-consuming. I reckon that it takes me about 4 hours typically to review a paper that I'm asked to look at in detail. Peer review is resistant to new or controversial ideas. It's by its nature quite a conservative process. I guess ultimately, though, the questions that the reviewer has to answer are, is it true and is it new? We find that agreement between referees is often little higher than by chance, and the process is vulnerable to misconduct, to plagiarism, and breach of confidentiality. So we have to guard very carefully against all of these aspects. And so there are processes in place to watch out for those. Some of the most cited papers of all times were rejected by referees. So let's move on now to how do you go about writing a paper? The first thing is to have a look at the content and the structure of the paper. Make sure that you have a clear story to tell. You have a message to get through to somebody, and you have a structure in which to work, and you need to make that work for you as best and as clearly as possible. You should be adding something new, original, novel to the body of knowledge. And any arguments that are made in your paper should be presented clearly and logically and backed up with information that can be checked independently by others. So you must make sure you include enough data that people can go back and rework it their own way. You must make sure that things are properly referenced so that people can go back and check the origin of some of the assumptions that you might make in your arguments. Style guides that are put out by various journals provide useful information, and it's a good idea, if you haven't published a paper before, to read a few of these style guides from reputable journals. They will teach you a lot. Papers are structured in a very typical way. They contain a number of elements, each of which I will touch on in a little bit of detail, but there's a very familiar layout and form to the nature of a typical scientific paper. It begins with a title, of course, and that should be very clear and not misleading. Some titles are way too long, others are way too short, too grandiose in their scope. You need to be very clear about the subject that you're talking about. Somebody reading a title should be under no illusions as to what's going to be covered in the paper. When it comes to a list of authors, you'd think this is pretty straightforward, but in fact it isn't. Different journals and fields of study have their own widely diverging practices. In particle physics, for example, it is known that there have been papers to have more than 500 listed authors. It seems unworkable. You know, some papers aren't that long as the list of authors is. But in our fields, it's far more usual to have maybe 2 or 3 authors to a paper. The best practice is to have the primary author, the person who's most responsible for what's actually written down, should be listed first. The names should be listed according to their contribution, not in order of seniority. On that note, I think it's important to avoid the kindly titled honorary authorship by supervisors. There's been quite a trend in modern times to have people who've really made no direct contribution to the paper have their names listed as authors. I really think that's a reprehensible way of dealing with accrediting contributions to a paper. Each author should be able to point out their own direct contributions to what appears in the paper. Another fairly obvious point, maybe not so obvious, is to make sure you use your full initials with your surname when writing your list of authors. Maybe I'm acutely aware of this, having a common surname like Jones, where there are a number of R. Joneses in the world. In fact, there are a number of R.T. Joneses in the world. And every now and again, I have to make sure my list of publications that agents like Google collect under my name are in fact authored by me. There is a technique or a system known as the ORCID, which is a unique number that's assigned to each author if you register on the system, and that removes ambiguity from the names of authors. When it comes to the affiliation and contact details, I think it's become modern practice to list at least the department and the company name or institution where the authors are from, as well as a city and country, just to give some sense of place to where the work originates from. These days, people generally dispense with mailing addresses and phone numbers, and simply an email address of the primary or corresponding author will suffice. It's easy enough to find contact information in today's world. The next item that appears on the paper is the abstract or synopsis. And this appears first, but probably should be written last, after you have written everything else in your paper, because it is really intended to be a brief overall summary of all of the findings. It's not an introduction to the paper. It should encapsulate the important results or conclusions and how they were achieved. Just on the subject of abstracts, people often think that abstracts submitted to conferences are unchangeable things. They certainly aren't. And in fact, I would recommend that they can and should change in the final paper to reflect a summary of not what the author planned to write, but in fact what was found and what was said in the final version of the published paper. The introduction should provide context and necessary background information. It shouldn't be overly broad, and the author should avoid unsubstantiated. For example, if you can't be sure that you have got a correct statement, you should rather leave it out of the introduction. This section often contains more errors than the rest of most papers. I can give one practical example in my own field, that of chromite smelting for the manufacture of ferrochromium. It's very easy for a beginner author in the subject to talk about South Africa having the world's largest reserves of chromite and producing the most ferrochromium in the world. Now that was true until 2012 when China took over, and very often is a mistake that people might make if they're only referencing older publications and not checking on the latest status. Best leave it out if you're not sure. Figures and tables are very useful for summarizing information, and it's important to ensure that graphs and figures are clear without extraneous information. Labels and scales should be large enough to be clear, even when the diagrams are reduced to a 2-column smaller layout. The exact layout of tables, in other words, which lines go where, will be specified in the style guide of the selected journal. Finally, you get to the acknowledgements. Now, this is the place that team members and supervisors or funders can be thanked for their contributions. It's a way of including the recognition for all of those whose names are not on the list of primary authors of the paper. Then usually last on the list are the references. And for me, I find this is actually very interesting reading. I often read the lists of references, don't just simply refer to them. Different publications have their own styles of referencing with very fussy sets of rules in some cases. But overall, there are 2 types. There's the main types are the numbered system, usually with the superscript reference, just in order of which they appear. And then you get the alphabetic author date system. For example, see Jones 2015. And this is often referred to as the Harvard system. The Harvard system has a number of advantages. It's much easier to maintain a long, complicated document if you're not numbering all papers in the order in which they appear. And also, it makes it very visible to the reader without having to break their reading to see, oh, I see, yes, that's where you're quoting that paper. I'm familiar with Jones 2015, without having to go all the way to the list of references to see where a particular point was made. The Journal of the SAIMM moved to the Harvard system of referencing a few years ago. Another important thing is to cite primary literature rather than secondary sources. So don't just quote the most recent example of some particular statement. If possible, rather go back to the original and see where it was quoted. This is important because you'll find that numerous errors creep in and people start assuming that a quotation of some particular figure is actually true without going back to the original reference and seeing that in fact it's been an error that's been perpetuated over a long time instead. In the references, I prefer to see full information given. I know some journals have restricted space and they provide very restricted lists, so they would skip out the title, they would simply have the authors and the volume number and the page number perhaps. I prefer to see full information and also to include hyperlinks where possible, so that it's possible for people to go back and click and find the original papers immediately. That is a very useful thing to be able to do today with electronic publishing. Now, after your paper has been published, how do you know if your paper is any good? Will it even be read or cited by anyone? Citations are in fact rather rare. There was a study done of over 1.3 million papers across all disciplines and years, and they found that 61% of papers had 0 citations. It's a bit depressing. And 12% had only 1 citation, with 4% having 16 or more citations. Another study found that 75% of papers on metallurgy and mining are not cited at all. Citations of journal papers are most common in biological and physical sciences. You can just imagine how many citations there are about coronaviruses today. But this is less so in engineering, where conferences are more important quite often, and where implementation is more important than publication. There are a number of measurements that are possible when looking at scientific output. The laziest, simplest way would be to simply count the number of papers that a researcher has produced. Maybe a little better, but a bit harder, is to look at the number of citations that they have had over their publications career. Maybe you could simplify that number into the number of citations per paper. And then ultimately, with a bit more complexity, but perhaps the most useful single number, would be something known as the H-index, which I'll explain in a moment. Citation indexing was pioneered by Eugene Garfield back in 1955. This was quite an accomplishment, as he took about 70% of refereed scientific journal papers and indexed all of the references in each of those, and in so doing created what became known as the Web of Science. This was quite an undertaking in pre-internet days. The H-index was proposed in 2005 by George Hirsch, who is a physics professor at the University of California in San Diego. And this is a way of measuring the impact and quantity of scientific output as a single number. And you could argue that H stands either for Hirsch or highly cited. And he defines the H-index as the maximum number of an author's papers that have been cited at least H times. So as an example, having an H-index of 17 means that a scientist has published 17 papers that each had at least 17 citations. And this avoids problems where the total number of papers does not indicate the quality of scientific publications, whereas citation counts can be disproportionately affected by a single publication of major influence. So this really provides a useful comparison between authors within a specific subject area. Don't use it to compare a young scientist with an older scientist, because H indices can only increase over time. Don't use it to compare an engineer with a biologist. The fields and citation patterns are entirely incomparable. Another important question to face as somebody who has a paper that they've written is, how do you choose which journal to publish in? These are the questions that I would pose. I would say, will it reach your intended audience? It's pointless to publish in a purely academic journal if you want to be read by people in industry. Similarly, a trade journal will probably not be taken seriously by a university audience. The next question is it open access? I believe there is a moral imperative to make scientific publications freely available to all people without restriction. Many governments, including the United States, the UK, even South Africa, have mandated that all publicly funded research must be published via open access. In 2007, SAIMM's journal and conference papers were made free of charge to everyone. Open publications are visible to search engines such as Google, thereby making them easily found. This serves the interests of authors in that they want their writing to have maximum reach and impact and want their work to be discussed and cited often. It also serves the interests of readers who desire low cost or free access to a wide range of information. Peer reviewers are also usually authors and readers, so their interests are looked after too. The next question I would ask is the journal regarded as reputable? For example, the Department of Higher Education and Training, DHET, in South Africa, publishes an annual list of recognized reputable journals whose papers are eligible for academic subsidy funding. The Journal of the SAIMM has always been included in this list as part of both the Web of Science that is owned by Clarivate, which used to be Thomson Reuters and used to be ISI before that, and the SciELO lists. So we have our credentials recognized on two fronts. It's important to avoid predatory journals. There are some unscrupulous paid open access journals that guarantee quick turnaround times and publication upon payment of a fee. This is seen as a highly disreputable practice. Publishing these journals will adversely affect your career and reputation. Just don't do it. And this will include your rating as a researcher with the National Research Foundation, the NRF, in South Africa. Another question that occurred to me is it on onemind.org? This premier database of over 100,000 mining and metallurgical papers is often the first port of call for members of the Global Mineral Professionals Alliance, or GMPA. This includes the AusIMM from Australia, CIM from Canada, IIMCH from Chile, IIMP from Peru, IOM3 from the UK, SAIMM from Southern Africa, and SME from the USA. That's quite an important global audience. There's another question that comes up, and this is where I'm going to try and get contentious. What are impact factors, and are they important? Now, Eugene Garfield, for whom I have a lot of respect, first introduced the concept of a journal impact factor in 1955, when he was director of the Institute for Scientific Information, ISI, which later became part of Thomson Reuters and is now owned by Clarivate, used to be called Clarivate Analytics. The Journal Impact Factor, or JIF, was created as a tool to enable the appropriate selection of journals for inclusion in citation indices and to assist librarians to identify which journals to purchase. And it's useful for these purposes. It represents, broadly speaking, the average number of times that each article is cited in a year, averaged over the 2 previous years. But it does not measure the scientific quality of research in an article. The San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, which is published online, recommends that scientific output is not measured by the use of journal-based metrics, such as the journal impact factor. Why is this important, you ask? Well, this declaration was subscribed to by editors and publishers of the world's leading scientific research instruments. These include Nature magazine, Science, etc. It is said that research should be assessed on its own merits rather than on the basis of the journal in which it is published. Just to elaborate a little on the journal impact factor for those not familiar with it, this is defined as the ratio of the number of citations in the current year to the items published in the previous 2 years to the total number of articles published in the same 2 years. Well, let's expand on that with an example. So the journal impact factor for a particular journal in 2019 would be the number of citations in 2019 to papers, articles that are published in 2017 and 2018, divided by the total number of articles published in 2017 and 2018. It has to be noted that the vast majority of articles in a given journal receive fewer citations than the impact factor would predict. On the other hand, There are some papers in a journal that may receive hundreds more citations than the impact factor might lead you to assume. Problems with the journal impact factor are numerous. They cannot be used to meaningfully compare journals in different fields. They're widely criticized for use as a lazy proxy for quality of a particular paper. The intrinsic merit of a paper is much more important than where it is published. Another important thing is that regarding the veracity of the information that gets published. Publications in high-ranking journals are not only more likely to be fraudulent than articles in lower-ranking journals, but also more likely to present discoveries which are less reliable. In other words, they are inflated or cannot subsequently be replicated. And some of the sociological mechanisms behind these correlations have been well documented, such as the pressure to publish, preferably positive results in only high-ranking journals, that's what everybody would most like, leading to the potential for decreased ethical standards. It's like the story of why do you rob a bank? It's because that's where the money is, that's where the reputation is. So beware of that. Other deficiencies of the journal impact factor for research assessment were highlighted in the San Francisco Declaration research assessment from 2012. And these include the following. Citation distributions within journals are highly skewed. Properties of the journal impact factor are field specific. It is a composite of multiple highly diverse article types, which is very true for SIMN's journal, including primary research papers and reviews. Journal impact factors can and are often manipulated or gamed by editorial policy. Data used to calculate journal impact factors are neither transparent nor openly available to the public. So the recommendation in the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment is do not use journal-based metrics such as journal impact factors as a surrogate measure of the quality of individual research articles to assess an individual scientist's contributions or in hiring, promotion, or funding decisions. I'd encourage you to read the declaration online. It's only a couple of pages and makes very interesting reading. I have also got a whole lot more information available on impact factors if you'd like more on that information. But that's not the only practice to avoid. There are a number of other areas, possible pitfalls to be avoided. When writing a paper, it's important to avoid conflicts of interest. Nobody should take seriously somebody writing on the benefits of sugar consumption when their work is sponsored by Coca-Cola. You should avoid the omission of data. If some data doesn't quite fit your pattern, there's no excuse for simply leaving it out for no good reason, and especially not for fabricating data. These can lead to very severe consequences. There is one particular paper that was completely fabricated on the drawbacks of vaccinations that has led to thousands of people around the world avoiding vaccination and the concomitant spread of viruses as a result of that. It's important to avoid plagiarism, including self-plagiarism. In other words, taking large chunks of information and repurposing them from paper to paper. Of course, this can happen acceptably, maybe for a sentence or two, but you shouldn't use this as a vehicle for simply publishing the same thing more than once. You should limit self-citation in lists of references. You should cite fully and fairly. Don't speculate in papers, rather stick to the facts. Another practice to be avoided is known as salami publishing. That's the publication of least publishable units, trying to get more papers than is really warranted out of one particular subject. Rather say it well, and say it in one place. Duplicate publication of papers is another area of possible pitfalls. For example, where a paper is published in formal conference proceedings and then again in a journal. This has happened quite widely, and this is really only a recent prohibition against this. And SIM will in fact be changing some of its previous practices in this regard. We've had, which had some benefits, a policy of taking selected papers from our conferences and publishing them for wider dissemination to our members in the journal. And this is something we'll have to cut back on, and people will have to choose whether they're going to publish their paper in formal conference proceedings or in a journal. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that peer-reviewed scientific papers add significantly to the world's body of knowledge. Reputable open access journals help to make information available to all. There is no shortcut to evaluating the quality of a paper. It needs to be read carefully. The intrinsic merit of a paper is much more important than where it is published. The relevance and quality of a paper are much more important than the impact factor of the journal in which it is published. And overall, you are encouraged to make your contribution to the world of scientific publications. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodney. That was very nice. I enjoyed it thoroughly. And I see there's quite a lot of audience participation. So to get us to help answer some of the questions, I'm going to curate them a little bit to get us something. So one of the questions that came up in different forms is about referencing. So very old references. One of your points earlier was about using the primary source or the original source or reference. One question, for example, from Josias is, how old can a reference or source be in a paper?
I would say if you are talking about a field such as the design of electrical parameters in an electric arc furnace, there was some primary information that was done a few decades ago by Westley. And it's very useful to go back and say the original equations for design of electrode spacing appeared in this particular reference. And there I would go to give the oldest possible reference in that particular case. But I would also try and complement that by quoting recent developments in the field. It is important to say, well, that wasn't necessarily the last word on the subject. And in fact, then I would try and say, recent developments have included these modifications as in last year's reference, for example. So I would have a range, but I would make sure that I try and quote the original rather than perhaps just a paper that summarized it conveniently maybe 10 years ago and used that review paper as my source of the original equation.
Okay, and then a little bit following on that, I think there's a sort of a question of what do you do if you do not have access to the primary source, for example? I don't know if you have an answer to that question.
It's a tricky one, especially given my strong feelings about open access publications. Mm-hmm. I think it is rare today to not be able to get hold of a paper if it's important. I do fully understand that some papers that you might want to kind of reference in passing might not warrant all the effort that's involved in tracking it down. But if you're going to talk about the original equations, for example, I believe it's worth making the effort to source that original paper. If you can't find it yourself, talk to somebody else who's familiar with the field. Perhaps they'll have it in their library of collected papers. Alternatively, there are numerous sites on the internet by some radicals, perhaps, who've gone out and collected papers and made them publicly available, sometimes in defiance of copyright regulations and sometimes in accordance with them. And I think it usually can be done that you can get to the original paper. It may require a bit of effort, but I believe it's worth making.
Yeah, I think Rodney and I are both smiling because I think in the last 3 years we've had many conversations where I said, Rodney, I can't find this paper. And then, you know, you can often in colleagues ask no colleague, someone knows somebody, and especially somebody who's very well established in the publication world. They often reference very seminal papers, and then you can email them and ask them, you know, dear professor, I see you reference this paper. May I please have a copy? People often keep their libraries up to date. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning is that there are still some good libraries that can find papers for you in libraries all over the world, like a technical library that is linked with SIMM. They can often find you a paper as well. And then I think, so the questions about this is came up quite a few times, Rodney. Is secondary referencing recommended when the original paper has been written a very long time and its online presence cannot be traced anymore? And I think we've answered that.
Well, I'd like to add a little bit to that, perhaps. Yes. I think it can be quite embarrassing if somebody writes, if somebody references the original publication, they give the reference, and it can be embarrassing when you find there's an error in the reference that's been perpetuated through people quoting references of references of references. Can also be quite embarrassing when somebody quotes the original reference and you write to them and say, won't you please send me a copy of that paper? And then they embarrassedly say, well, actually, I don't have a copy of the original paper. I just read about it. I really emphasize it's important to go back to the original wherever possible. However, there are some cases where you want to talk about it in a more roundabout way. You know, if you want to quote Newton's equations and you don't simply just want to take them for granted, which I think is quite reasonable to do, but you wanted to say something about where they were originally published, you probably don't want to go back to the original Latin, in which case it would be acceptable in your reference to not fool anybody, but simply say, this was published in Principia Mathematica, and then in brackets afterwards, as referenced by wherever it was that you read about it. So you're not pretending you went back to the original reference. You are saying what the original reference is, to the best of your knowledge, and you are saying where you saw it. So that it at least is a referenceable chain that people can go back and trace it themselves if they want to.
Okay, so Rodney, we've got a very, very interested attendee group. So I'm going to go through a few quick questions again. There's a question, when referencing a diagram, is it necessary to indicate the page number in the original source?
I think the purpose of doing that is to say, would it make it easy enough for somebody to find it? So if it's in a 10-page paper, I don't see any sense in producing a page number for it. The references would obviously include the range of page numbers anyway, and you can just as well flick through 10 pages and find it. Similarly, if you're referencing a diagram in a book that has a well put together list of figures, then it's probably necessary to list the page number. But think about it from the reader or the user's point of view. If you were the reader trying to trace that original figure, would you appreciate somebody telling you the page number on which to find it? If so, then include it. So it's a question of judgment. If it's a 500-page book and it's not very well laid out, then give people some help. It's only kind to do that. There's no hard and fast rule on it, I wouldn't say.
So another question that I think is quite interesting for debate is, if there is a hyperlink, for example, to the Infocom papers on Mintech's website, do you still need to type out all the conference details? So much space and time.
Yes, I believe you do, because it's like the argument that is used in Nature magazine, where the list of references typically is maybe half a line long. It's just the abbreviation of the journal, the issue number, volume number, and page number, and that's it. No titles, no further information about the background to the paper. And there's place for that. So yes, and a hyperlink to a properly referenced paper is fine. However, not all papers that are available at the other end of the hyperlink contain their own references. This is something that I would strongly encourage people to make sure that if you put your paper on a website repository somewhere, make sure that the actual full written reference appears on that PDF document, so that people can see where it came from. I think there's place to be made for references being readable. So you, in fact, would benefit from not just being able to click on the paper and finding it, but to be able to just quickly scan your eye over the list of references and see, oh, this was published in Beijing in whichever year it was. Oh, that's interesting. That provides context and information about the reference that isn't necessarily visible in the hyperlink itself. So I would encourage both.
Yeah, I agree, Rodney. I think it's nice to have the paper. You make it easy for the next person to go and check it via the hyperlink. But there's a lot of acknowledgement of events such as Infocon in the references, so you can see the context of the paper. It creates value for me. So there's an interesting question. How do you handle case study kind of papers where, say, there are learnings from some practices rather than a proper scientific review, which I think is a very good question.
Yeah, I think there's absolutely a place for that. There's certainly some journals that would encourage it. There are other journals who would discourage it. So you'll have to choose your publication carefully. But again, case studies are things that are useful to a particular audience. They may not be interesting to absolutely everybody. So try and think very carefully of who your intended audience is, who would benefit from those case studies, and publish in a journal that's going to be read by people in that field. And then I certainly think there's place for that. But again, is it something that is new? Is it something that's a little bit original, novel? Or is it just merely, oh, we did the same old thing and we got the expected results and nothing new came of it? That's not interesting to anybody and probably doesn't warrant publication. But if there is something to be learned from it, then by all means, submit it for publication.
Yeah, thank you. Also, I was going to format the next question as, hi, I would like to ask a question regarding one of the criteria for a good paper. What do you mean by, is it new? Please, could you elaborate on this? And does the idea have to be new in entirety, or can it also be new in the application of the idea?
Well, I would start by saying from the biblical quotation that says there is nothing new under the sun. And in a global sense, that is indeed the case. There are very, very, very few things that haven't been spoken about or investigated before. And you can see this if you go back into the historical archives of the SIMM's journal, for example. You know, more than 100 years ago, they were talking about many of the same topics that we see being published and discussed today, often with a slightly different angle, but again, the subject is of relevance and interest. But to simply regurgitate something that's been said many times before is not of interest to anybody. So there needs to be something novel that makes your paper, your contribution worthwhile. But it doesn't mean to say it's got to be completely original, completely earth-shatteringly new, not at all. It's just, is there a fresh angle that you're bringing to this particular subject? Then that satisfies the requirements as far as I'm concerned.
And then I think there's a lot of people who's never written a paper, but there's a question about what are the main considerations in the planning phase of writing a paper? So how can you break it up into manageable chunks, or how to maintain a structure? Any tips from your years of writing of papers, Rodney?
Again, go back to the very, very starting point. You have a story to tell. So think of how you would tell the story. You know, the usual thing, if you were caught in a lift with the most influential person and you had, you know, only a few seconds to tell them the essence of what it is that you're doing, could you get that message across? Crystallize the essence of your thoughts into a clear statement. And that'll often guide the way in which it is structured. And then you say, okay, that's the main point that I want to bring it across. How logically do I tell the story that builds up to this particular conclusion, or these measurements, or whatever it is that I'm trying to describe? So think of it from the audience's point of view and how you make this into an interesting story. Could you explain this to your niece or nephew, for example? Could you tell them very simply what it is that you have done? And maybe use that to guide your structure and the way in which you put it together.
Another good question, is it okay and professional to acknowledge a family member or a parent for a scientific paper?
It would be very unusual for a scientific paper. It's quite common to acknowledge that in a thesis or a dissertation, for example, where often the family member is the one who's made the biggest sacrifice over many, many years of having to put up with the particular investigation going on. So there might be a case for it. It would be unusual, I would say. If there is a contribution to the paper, to the content itself that they have made, maybe they've helped you to clarify an idea. That in that case, it'd be perfectly appropriate to say thank you to my lifelong partner who made me think about how to express these ideas clearly. That would be perfectly acceptable in the acknowledgements. But just to say thanks to my wife and my kids and my dog for putting up with the fact that I've been away from home for a few days while I've been isolating myself writing this paper, that doesn't really add much to people reading the paper.
Okay, thank you. And Rodney, here's a question for you on an opinion. What is your opinion on the future of proper peer-reviewed and published conference-based proceedings, given that journals are often valued more highly, and particularly by academia? If people are asked to choose one or the other, they might prefer conferences which do not publish proceedings and rather publish in a journal later. And I think that also leads into some of the questions around this whole change in how we publish our conference papers, or republishing of our conference papers.
I think this is a very difficult area that we're going to have to grapple with, and I'm sure that there are going to be many false starts made along the way. I do see it at the moment moving to maybe 3 different classifications of conferences. You will get informal, quick to organize conferences that really don't publish formal conference proceedings with its own ISBN number and go through the whole formal peer review process. There are conferences that follow that format, that will say, well, come and talk, give your presentation, don't even bother with a paper. Perhaps they will say, provide a 1-page extended abstract so that there's something for people to engage with. And there's place for those conferences. There's also, perhaps at the other end of the spectrum, those highly prestigious conferences. You mentioned Infocon earlier, the World Gold Conference, perhaps, the Copper Cobre series of conferences, perhaps one of the national or continent-wide metallurgical conferences. There it would be highly prestigious, and I would argue perhaps more prestigious to have your paper published in those conference proceedings than in a particular journal. And I think in those cases, the rigorous peer review that's currently employed would carry on, and publication in a formal conference proceedings would be the right way to go. It's a more useful way of concentrating the scientific record to know that all of the papers, all of the significant in a particular field in a particular year will be found in that particular conference proceedings. That to me is a very valuable thing. So there will be place for formal conferences with formal conference proceedings. But those authors will have to do it in the full knowledge that that paper will be a conference paper and will not be a journal paper. But I think there's place for that. It may not be universal, but I would say that there's still going to be a place for that in the future. And then there will be that middle ground of conferences, the third category, where it's somewhere between those two extremes. Perhaps there will be some conferences, I'm speculating here, that will allow some people to put full papers together and to publish them for the record in an ISBN proper printed conference proceedings. But maybe they'll be flexible. Maybe they will allow other people to simply provide a one-page summary, which will be specifically marked. This is not a publication, just so that there's no doubt about the fact that this can't be claimed as a technical publication. And maybe they would also then allow just presentations only. So there might be a sort of a hybrid model that develops over time, but I would say there's still going to be place at both ends of the spectrum as well.
Yeah, I think, Rodney, the conclusion from my side of being involved in the technical program committee of SIMM is that we have to start with some kind of hybrid system. One of the suggestions, for example, is that when you have a big conference like InfoCon or IMPC, where there's a branding, that publication, that conference proceeding has value. So you don't want to then remove the value for a big conference like those by not publishing the proceedings, but perhaps then highlighting the very top papers by abstracts in the journal is one of the suggestions to handle this. And I think that's quite a nice way to just deal with both of these issues. I think it is, what's happening is, there's a question here that says, perhaps for everybody who's not familiar, with regards to the self-plagiarism concept, how does this apply to one single publication presented at various events? I think perhaps not everybody understands the intricacies of self-plagiarism. Maybe you can explain a little bit.
One of the issues in South Africa in particular is a very sensitive one with regard to self-plagiarism and republishing the same paper in essence. And nobody is fooled by, you know, a 10% change to a paper and not saying that it's the same paper. We're saying essentially the bulk of the paper remains unchanged. It should appear once in the scientific record is what current good practice indicates. So contrary to the idea of republishing and explicitly referencing where it was first published, a paper in a journal that's been published at a previous conference. Now, in South Africa, in a university setting, the Department of Higher Education and Training provides a significant financial subsidy to the universities, sometimes to the departments, and sometimes even to the research funds of the individual researcher for publishing technical papers. They score journal papers more highly than conference papers, but it has happened, I suspect, in the past that people have tried to put forward a paper, the same essential paper, for subsidy purposes in more than one way. And the rules on this perhaps were a bit ambiguous in days gone by as well. Although I would say that the chances of it happening currently are very small indeed, given the stringent auditing procedures that are in place, both at the departmental and university level, and then again at the DHET as well. So I think it would be seen as wrong to get a subsidy twice for essentially the same research output, the same technical work. So in that sense, you can make a very clear, strong argument for why it would be wrong in that sense to publish a paper, the same paper, twice. I think there are mitigating circumstances in which you could easily explain how this could have happened in the past without any ill intent by people, where people would produce a good piece of work at a conference and have that requested by a publication for republication in a journal to reach a wider audience. And so you can make a good argument for that. I guess the argument, the strong argument is that you don't want to have duplication on the scientific record. it makes it frustrating for somebody who sees the same, what looks like the same paper in two different places. So if I see a paper that's really relevant to my field, that looks very similar, and it's in two places, I'm forced then to read it, to read both copies of it, to see, well, is there some special nuance that's coming out in the one that isn't in the other? And so it's a waste of time for other people. And so that, for that reason, you'd want to discourage it. But at the same time, you don't want to fragment the scientific record. And again, here, that's where the keeping everything together from a conference is important, which is why I believe there will still be a place for formally published conference proceedings. You don't want to say, well, some things that were presented here appear in the conference proceedings, and some things presented occur in, or presented, or published rather, in a separate journal, maybe more than one journal. That makes it hard to keep track of. So those are some of the arguments for and against. It is an area of grey. There's no doubt about it. It's not a clear-cut thing of pretending to publish, pretending that somebody else's work is yours, which is really what plagiarism is about. But self-plagiarism is kind of an approximation to that.
Yeah, I think the internet and the availability of papers and publications just have made us more vulnerable to this, and you publish it much quicker. I mean, I think if you go back to your example of in the early days, it took them 2 years to publish a paper, if not longer, because of that rigorous peer review. So it brings me to one of the questions: how long should one allow for peer reviews when you submit a paper, I presume, to a journal?
Yes, it's one of the most frustrating things being on the editorial board of a journal, is the response or non-response of potential reviewers. And it's a fundamental flaw in the whole peer review system. The people most capable of doing the very best technical reviews are going to be the busiest people who've got many other things on their plates and cannot possibly prioritize reviewing somebody else's paper over much of the other paid work that they're intended to be doing. And so you really are at the mercy of volunteers. One can hope that a volunteer who is too busy will quickly respond, ideally, to say, sorry, too busy, please give this to somebody else. But that doesn't happen in practice in the real world. People's email boxes are overflowing. They can't get to half of the things that are in it, so they may not even see the request to review papers. So what is reasonable? Well, maybe I'll start by saying what is unreasonable. And this is one of the telltale signs of predatory publishers. They will say things like, we guarantee you that our papers will be reviewed within two weeks. That is unrealistic. You cannot have the priority call on somebody's time if they are truly an expert and expect a 2-week turnaround on reviewing a paper. That's simply not going to happen. So either they've got somebody who is not a technical expert reviewing it, or they are taking a shortcut, or in the worst cases of the real predatory publishers, they're not doing anything at all. So for me, I would say a few months would be what your expectation should be. Ideally, it would be nice to get it within a 2 to 3 month turnaround time. 6 months is not unusual as a turnaround time for reviewers. Much longer than that is clearly undesirable, though.
Yeah, I think it is a tough business. If you want it to be peer reviewed, you are reliant on usually quite a small group of people. So, I mean, if you are like me, I receive probably requests for peer reviewing almost daily. And I'm sure Rodney is asked 6-7 times a day, if not more. So, Rodney, I think there's a question here. It says, if you think that the level of examination for peer-reviewed papers, where you pay the publication fee, where you pay for open access and non-open access, do you think that these high-impact journals give different level of peer review for the people who are willing to pay the fee?
No, I don't believe that a reputable journal, and some reputable journals do charge page fees for authors to publish. Has to be said, journals like the SIIMM journal make it free for readers as well as for authors. But there are some reputable journals who will bring in their money by charging authors instead of readers, and that's probably better than charging readers for papers. They will still use the free services of reviewers and the same reviewers. So regardless of whether somebody has paid or not paid a fee for publishing in a paper, it will still go to the same reviewers in my experience. And I don't believe it'll be treated any differently whether you're paying for it or not paying for it.
I think, I mean, it is that when you don't know when you're peer reviewing a paper whether that person is going to pay the fee or not. So yeah. Just from the other perspective. So this is a very interesting question from Herman Otterdam about something that Rodney and I both have had long discussions about is, what do you do when you find an error in a paper? How do you deal with that?
There are a number of ways of dealing with it. I guess the first thing to do is to be sure that it is in fact an error. And so it's the only polite thing to do is to write to the author and very politely point out to them or question it, or at least ask the question. I know this happened to me in one particular case, looking at the activity coefficients of cobalt. I had to write to the Japanese author and say, your graph and your equations just simply don't make sense to me. And he wrote back saying, I'm sorry, this is a terrible mistake. Please do not quote these equations again. And so that's certainly your starting point. In some journals, it's possible to get an erratum published. In electronic journals, you can in fact go back to the PDF versions of that paper and indicate on the paper that an error has been found and corrected, and here is the story about when it was done, how it was done, as an extra piece that can be added onto the PDF copy. Sometimes it's simply necessary to include it in your own papers when reviewing work done in a particular field. You might have to simply say, the equations for slag viscosity seem to have developed a life of their own. Some of the numbers that appear in them have accumulated errors over time. The incorrect equations can be found in the following references, and here is where you find the authoritatively correct version. And again, usually it's a good idea to consult with the author of the work before making statements like that, just so that you in turn can also have any potential errors that you are making corrected along the way. It's an imperfect system, unfortunately, but those are the best suggestions I have for now.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's the same way as when you are reviewing a whole set of literature, and so you can differ in opinion from other people's conclusions. You can state what they say, and you can say, this is why I disagree. I think equations are particularly vulnerable to typesetting errors, and we've had nice discussions about this, where you can use the same equation and everybody republishes it, and it comes back to that, going back to the original source to make sure that over time people haven't made a mistake in the equation, for example, because we tracked down quite a few of those. There's a lot of questions. I don't think we're going to get to all of them, but I think I'll ask one or two last ones just to close out the session. I think this is quite an interesting question in terms of style, perhaps, and how to deal with it. The question is, if you are invoking a long list of citation support for a commonly held concept, whether correct or incorrect, and often occurring in the introduction, should each of the cited papers be elaborated upon somewhere in the body of the text following?
I think the only time you want to cite those papers is if they add something to the argument that you're making. So simply to have a catalogue of papers saying the same thing, presenting the same view, that really only has validity if you're trying to, for example, look at the etymology of words where, you know, the number of times that it's used in one way versus the number of times that it's used in another way is relevant to the argument. So there it would be perfectly acceptable to say, well, it's used in this case, see references 1 to 100, and used in this way, see references 200 to 300, whatever it might be. Again, ask the question, is this reference adding particular value to what my argument is? And am I sufficiently recognizing the work of those who have gone before me that has informed my views and has defined the field in which I'm working? So it's not a very direct answer, I'm afraid. I'm sure I'd be able to give a more direct answer with a more specific example, because I don't think it's a difficult one to judge, but it's a difficult one to give a generic answer to.
Yeah, it's also it's a lot of judgment in terms of, again, you have to look at who's the original person with the theory, or is the point that you're trying to make that 100 people said this, because it has to add the value. So I think it's worth it. So I've got a question from someone who says, in your opinion, if an abstract is a summary of the main observations made and the ways in which they were made, how does the abstract differ from the conclusions?
The conclusions can perhaps say a little bit more, and perhaps in more detail. There's very often there will be an overlap. In fact, if there wasn't an overlap, it would be quite surprising. If you like, the abstract is something that you should be able to not read and not miss out any of the content of the paper. But on the other hand, the abstract should be the only thing you can read and get all of the main points of the paper. So if the point of your paper is, I have measured the viscosity of a slag and under these compositions and temperatures, and the answer is 3, then you should be able to state that in your abstract, and that is the essential message of your paper.
I think that's a good answer, really.
Is that good enough for the moment? Yes. Okay, let's move on. Right.
There's a question here that I've got 2 questions that I think can be used together. So you mentioned data, especially in the context of repeatability of results. Could you comment on the use of open data repositories or similar mechanisms to share raw data? And I'd like to add the question I have somewhere a little bit lower in terms of large data sets. What is the best way to deal with exceptionally large data sets in terms of providing public access to the data foundation of the paper? We all have been frustrated by data tables published in font 6. And I think the 2 questions have some relation. What is your opinion on open data repositories or similar mechanisms for raw data? And what do you think about these large data sets? How do we deal with them?
First of all, I would say I do strongly support the principles of open science, be that open access so that the literature is readable, open data so that people can go and get copies of the data for themselves, to rework it, to check it, check the validity of it, to be able to derive new results from it. This is very important, if you like, in things like genetic sequencing, for example, where you certainly wouldn't want a published paper to contain all of the genetic code for a particular organism, but it would be very important to have all of that data available to somebody. In today's world, it would be unnecessary to simply have to write to the author and say, please, will you send me a copy of your data? It should simply be referenced in the paper itself, saying further data is available at this particular hyperlink, and make sure it's a place that has some longevity to it, so that somebody reading a paper in 10 years' time can still expect to find the data in the same place online. So for any areas of moderate complexity, where it's not difficult, where you're talking about perhaps a few megabytes at a time, it's not a difficult thing to find storage space on some website that can have its lifetime guaranteed and you can make that data available for posterity. Of course, if you're dealing with much, much larger data sets, then it does become more complex, that you need to find somebody who's going to pay for significant amount of storage. And so there you would perhaps have to take a slightly different approach. But it's almost analogous to the question that will be faced after this webinar. Where do you store the video version of this talk? Do you put that onto the SAIMM website? But it's a large quantity of data. Is it perhaps better to put it onto YouTube, where they've got all of the data storage facilities to scale this up significantly? So it's, as I say, it's an analogous question perhaps. But yes, it is important. The principle is one that is completely clear. Make your data available so that other people can use it. If your data is a simple tables worth, then put it all in your paper. If it's more than you could fit into a publication, then put up a link somewhere where that data can be found going forward in time.
So I think we've really overrun our time, but it was such an interesting discussion. I think there's so many questions still left, but if Rodney, if you still have 5 minutes, I can go through a few more if you don't mind.
I'm available. Please carry on.
So Rodney, there's a question here which I think is a little bit on the controversial side of your presentation, but I know you're not scared of controversy. Do you have any advice on addressing the issue of honorary authorship if you're located at an institution where it is customary to always include supervisors as authors, regardless of their contribution?
It is a very difficult thing to overcome entrenched practice, because in doing that, there are always unexpected consequences that happen along the way. But I believe it's an important thing to debate. So maybe you don't make the change instantaneously if you're stuck in a system like that, because otherwise you'll be prejudiced. If you're the only one who says, well, I don't put my name as supervisor on all of the publications of my students, then suddenly you are going to be compared to your peers in the same department, the same university, and you're going to be judged according to different standards. Perhaps if you're confident enough, you should take the risk and do it anyway. But at least open up the debate. Say this isn't a good practice to pursue. It's perfectly, I think all of the arguments for having the name of a supervisor in the list of authors can be answered by having the name appear in the acknowledgements. It's still searchable. You can still find all of the papers where this person has been involved, but you're not claiming authorship and the hard work that goes into preparing a paper if you haven't actually gone into preparing it yourself. So yeah, I have some sympathy for people stuck in that position. Often it's very difficult to break with established practice. And I do have to still confess a little bit of personal sadness for the fact that some of my postgraduate supervisors, who are no longer with us, I don't have a joint publication with them because essentially the work was done and published by myself. So the record will not show in the list of shared publication credits that I was in fact affiliated with those people. So there is some argument to be said for having it, but I think there's a much stronger argument for not pretending to have contributed to a paper where in fact your contribution was not significant.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting topic, perhaps for a nice panel discussion in the near future. We can get a lot of people involved because I just say there's always two sides to the story. I've got two last technical questions that I thought you might be able to help us with. Regarding OneMine, Quinn says he notices that TMS is conspicuous by their absence. Is there any plans for them to come aboard on OneMine?
Yes, to a degree. The way the Global Mineral Professionals Alliance works is that they try and get representation from different areas of the world, by societies who represent both mining and metallurgy. TMS represents metallurgy and materials science. In fact, maybe 90% materials science, 10% metallurgy, an important 10% nonetheless. So in that sense, they're not a natural fit into that organization. I'm still canvassing that they should be formally involved as a full member of the organization, but that may or may not happen, and it may or may not happen fast. But having said that, there is a lot of traction within TMS for contributing some of the conference proceedings into the One Mine repository. And they also pay a fee to One Mine so that TMS members are able to access the database itself, albeit not as full contributing members.
I see there's also an interesting question. Maybe not everybody knows about the DOI system. What is your opinion of the value or lack thereof of DOIs? Perhaps you can first just explain to the attendees who don't know.
Yeah, DOI is a document object identifier that's essentially, there is a central repository of URLs effectively for each published paper in modern day practice. So in the SIMM journal, as an example, you will see that each paper has a DOI identifier so that you can simply type in that identifier and use that effectively as a hyperlink to retrieve the publication itself. It uniquely identifies a paper so that it makes the job of the citation indexing much easier. There's no doubt that a paper entitled something by this author could be muddled for a very similar sounding paper by maybe even a similar sounding selection of authors. Because again, people do make mistakes in citations, in lists of references. And so a DOI just helps to make it clearly unique and, you know, unambiguous.
Yeah, it's very useful.
It's not the only way of making sure that there is a URL that's permanent and where the publication is available on the internet, but it is certainly a system to support, and it's got widespread use in the publishing industry today. So it's a worthwhile thing to pursue.
I've got one last question, I think, before we wrap up, and it is William Shipman asking, where can he find the rule requiring public funded research in South Africa that is open access, should be open access journals?
Right, okay. In fact, there was a slight slip of the tongue that I had in my wording as I presented that. Well spotted. There are a number of places, and again, I can email you further documents on this if you like, William. In the United States and in the UK and numerous other countries, it is absolutely mandated that any publicly funded research has to be published under open access. In South Africa, I don't think it's quite got to the same level or same degree of prescription. It is strongly encouraged that South African publications that receive government or for which the research has been government funded should be published under open access. I'll have a look for you to see what I can find in the strongest possible wording. But yeah, if I was to say it again, I probably wouldn't have just strung them all together in exactly the same way. I would have tried to make a broader distinction. I was, in the interest of time, I was trying to just put them all packaged together.
Well done. Rodney, just again, I appreciate your time today, and it was a great interaction from the attendees. It was a wonderful presentation, and from my side, having had this interaction with you today was absolutely enjoyable, and I hope everybody else enjoyed it. I say thank you to everybody, but thank you mostly to you for your time.
Thank you very much. It was fun.
Thank you, Rodney. We'll hopefully have you again for this. I think it is definitely a discussion that warrants more great questions. Great questions.